What they say is that actually the whole feeling of being a self, being an I in control of this whole show called life, is a major illusion. And that this illusion creates a lot of suffering, right? So that's about the illusion of the self.
Messy and masterful. In this podcast, we speak about the success of people who have achieved, built, or done something amazing, special, remarkable, noteworthy, and/or fabulous. Think of presidents, doctors, chefs, architects, filmmakers, writers, philosophers, CEOs, journalists, and the list goes on of people who've had a genuine impact on this world. But rather than underlining their career victories, we speak about the challenges they needed to overcome to actually get there. In each episode, we discuss 3 of such challenges, obstacles, difficulties, and/or hurdles with our guest, putting the messy of their lives next to the masterful. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Aldo, Pape, and I'm so happy you could make it. So sit back, relax, and download the podcast here.
Yes, and it is a very beautiful day. Actually, another very beautiful day, because last time I got to speak to my guest, Dr. Michael Vlerick, it was a gorgeous day as well. So I think we're onto something here, Michael. Don't you think so? Whenever we speak, the sky opens up, and the sun comes out, and everything turns blue and magical.
The weather approves of our podcast, Aldo, and
Good.
Wonderful, because now as well, after discussing all of the problems and what stands in the way of our happiness, we're finally getting to the part of what can you do and how can you become happier or be as happy as possible.
Correct, yes. Dear listener, you do not see Michael, but he's very happy, a very big smile on his face, because he can finally start giving some advice. Whereas before we've been talking about, okay, here are things that cause our unhappiness. We now get some tips and tricks on how to remedy it. And therefore also Michael has dubbed this episode The Simple Recipe for Happiness, a title that I love. Before we go into the bits and pieces and the details, Michael, how are things going with the book? How are things on your end? Because every time I look in, social media, whatever, I see another interview coming up. I see more interest, so that makes me so happy, genuinely, for you. So hope everything is going well there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Aldo. Yeah, there's quite a bit of interest, and so from the press, and I think people like the message, and it's definitely a message that can reach, and I hope will reach many people, and then will have a positive impact on their lives.
Most definitely. So let's dive in. The simple recipe for happiness, and just dear listener, before we've spoken about a couple of topics around unhappiness. So we've spoken about happiness versus our genes, and then also happiness in our modern environment, right? That was the previous conversation. And now we're jumping to the simple recipe for happiness. So, Michael, what is the simple recipe for happiness?
Yes, let's get straight into it and then straight to the recipe, and then I'll unpack all of that, right? So there's 3 major elements to create a happy life, of a happy life as possible. And the first one is equanimity, which means that you won't feed negative emotions, negative mental reactions. And it's really what you need to cultivate to be able to kind of extract yourself from otherwise lingering negative emotions. And we'll see how we can do this. We'll also discuss this in the next episode. This one will really be the insights that can transform your life. And then the next episode, we'll talk about how we can actually cultivate these things, how we can train our brain to become happier. Right, so first one, equanimity. The second one is contentment. Remember hedonic adaptation and the fact that we always think that, I will be happy when, or I will really be happy when, but we're constantly dissatisfied and craving for things that we do not have at this moment. This stands in the way of a happy life, so we need to cultivate contentment. And then a third one, and this is what research shows has a major impact on our well-being, on our happiness, is the quality of our social connections, right? So prioritize these social connections. So this is very much a simple recipe for happiness. And interestingly as well, it's a timeless recipe, meaning that for over more than 2 millennia, people in the East, in the Buddhist tradition, in the West, in the Stoics and so forth, well, they came to this conclusion and they understood, and this is very much the main message at the start of this podcast that I want to deliver, that is that, and research shows this really clearly, in order to improve your happiness, you need to work on yourself. You cannot just work on your external circumstances. Scientific research shows that these external circumstances have a surprisingly small impact on our long-term happiness. At least, when you're not suffering from extreme negative conditions like poverty, war situations, and so forth. So let's hope this is the case for all of the listeners. In that case, well, it has a much, much smaller impact on your long-term happiness, these external circumstances, than you think. So what kind of happens is that we all have this basic set point of happiness. Well, if things go well, we kind of raise a little bit above that happiness set point. But remember hedonic adaptation, we get used to that very quickly. So very quickly we come back to our basic point, right? When things go badly, well, we dip under. But again, remember the people who were paraplegics and then who got used to their situation in a surprisingly small amount of time, like 6 months. They come back to their basic set point, right? So what we need to do is raise that basic set point. And this is something we can all do. And this is very much what working on these 3 important pillars of happiness will do for you. Equanimity, contentment, and loving interactions.
Wonderful, wonderful. So before we hit the record button, I said, like Michael, I always have thousands of questions to ask when you speak. So, instead of interrupting you, I have written them down now. So I loved what you said about external circumstances versus internal circumstances. So if we want to change our happiness, we need to be willing and able to work on ourselves, right? That's what you said. And then it will have an effect, not what happens to us externally. So is that because, does our happiness increase if we have the idea that we can slightly steer it ourselves? Is that what behind this? That we have control over something and therefore that we can direct it on a certain level? Is that what's behind that thinking, or is there more to it?
That's interesting that you asked that, because this feeling of control, and we'll get to that, kind of an illusion of control as well, is a very important psychological element. And we have this idea that we need to control what the world does in order for us to be happy, right? We need to prevent the bad things from happening and we need to get more of the good things, right? And then the balance will tip in our favor and we'll be happy. Now, again, this actually does not have a lasting impact on happiness. Even if you would be pretty successful in avoiding the bad things and getting more of the good things, well, you'd get used to these good things pretty quickly and they wouldn't deliver on their promises, right? But the feeling that we need to control what the world does actually actively contributes to our misery, to our unhappiness, right?
Misery. Okay.
And we'll get into that and these illusions that feed into this psychological suffering.
But what is it then about the fact that once we accept that we need to work on ourselves, we become a lot happier? Is it the fact that we accept it, or the fact that we see progress, the fact that the consciousness of the decision that allows us then to move forward?
Yeah, so maybe let's backtrack a little bit. And the way I start the book is with actually referring to a movie that is pretty well known, The Matrix. Now, for the people who haven't seen the movie, well, in The Matrix, there are these people, they're kept in, these big vats actually, and their brains are hooked up to some kind of program, and they are fed, artificial experiences. And the story in The Matrix is that, like evil robots, I think, or something like that, have taken over the world, and they use, these human bodies for energy. So they harvest their energy, and, to keep them sedated in these tubs in which they are kept, well, they just feed them artificial experiences. Anyways, I start the book by saying, look, in a way, we are in the matrix. And in another way, it's even worse than in the movie. Now, this is back to the dystopic part, but let me explain what I mean. Right, the way we experience the external world has much more to do with the way our brain and our psychology is wired than with what actually happens in the world, right? What we find pleasant or unpleasant, what causes us pleasure, what causes us pain, well, all of that obviously is in the brain, right? And there's good evolutionary reasons, and we've covered that, why certain things will cause us psychological and physical pain and other things will cause us pleasure, all of that. Right, but in contrast to what happens in the matrix, well, our brains are constantly generating negative emotions, physical pain, right? So we are also being fed artificial experiences in a way, artificial in the mean, not that and there's some weird robots giving us these experiences, but natural selection gave us a brain that interprets the outside world in a certain way, and the result of that is a lot of suffering. Right? There's nothing inherently good or bad in the world. These are just atoms colliding, if you will, but the way our brain interprets that, well, causes a lot of pain. Right? So the way to change that is to change the way our brain interprets things, the way our brain filters information, and the way our brain produces emotions in response. And that's what I mean by working on ourselves. It's really working on these three important things. First of all, to be happier, what we need is to suffer less from negative emotions, or less long and less intensely, right? So I think we can all agree on that. That would be wonderful. You know, less fear, stress, anxiety, anger, all of these things, despair perhaps. Less of that, less intensely. Then also more contentment and less a feeling of craving, and I need this for my happiness, and I cannot be really happy because at this stage, anyways, all of that we've covered. So more contentment. Together, those, I mean, they make all of the difference of the world. And then finally, the third element that really, I mean, since we're such social beings and so forth, that really contributes to happiness are these social connections. And so that is what research also shows, and that is what was known in these wisdom traditions, in Buddhism, but also in other traditions like Taoism in the East, and then Advaita Vedanta and in India and so forth. But in the West, you know, most prominently in the Stoics, but we'll see also in different kind of traditions, some of these elements have crept in, right? So work on your relation to negative emotions, work on your contentment of life, and then, you know, benefit from the warm feelings that are generated by these loving interactions.
And so, very concretely, so I'm an unhappy man, Dr. Vlerick, and not just suppose, right? In the previous episode, I revealed to you I'm a very happy man, but suppose I'm a very unhappy man. And you see me, I know you're a philosopher, you're not a doctor, nor are you a psychologist, but you advise me on the negative emotions bit. What can I, as a 40-plus-year-old man, do to kind of temper my emotions? Because it's kind of ingrained in me the way I respond to certain things, or is it not?
Definitely, and that's what we covered the last time, right? So remember our hyperactive threat detection or negativity bias, the fact that, I mean, our brain is wired to have all of these attention and to have a bigger impact from things that go badly than things that go well, right? So this we have working against us, and again, there's an evolutionary story behind that, but this is not or shouldn't be our fate. We can really rewire our brain and develop a kind of new way of dealing with these emotions. So perhaps,
movement... Yeah, so very concretely, so you would advise me to, for instance, look at things that temper emotions, you know, as we kind of implement them also in raising our kids, right? You know, go outside more sports, less screen time. That all helps to lower the heavy negative reactions, or, you know, whatever helps you to recognize your emotion, right? Those are good tips. Is that what you would suggest? You know, without going back to what caused it, what can we do? What's the kit that I can take away?
Yeah, so definitely all of these things that you mentioned are indeed good ideas and so forth, but they don't go to the core of the matter, right? So let me start with an example of where you would endure like negative emotions. You have an important meeting at work. You're well on time, everything is going well, your GPS says you'll be there 10 minutes before the start, so all is well in the world. But then something happens. You have a flat tire. And there you stand on the side of the road. You're going to miss that appointment. It was such an important appointment. And what is going to happen then, most likely, if you're wired like most people, well, is a stream of, alarming thoughts. Like, oh, why does this have to happen today? Of all days, why today? Why does this have to happen to me? And you know the drill, right? So all of these negative thoughts, what these negative thoughts are going to do is they're going to lengthen and make your negative emotional reaction of fear, anger, frustration, whatever you're feeling, more intense, right? So, and this strengthened feeling will then again lead to more of these negative, alarming thoughts and so forth. And you're in the grip of negative emotions for a really, really long time. All right. Research has shown that if you do not feed negative emotions with more of these negative, alarming thoughts, that they should not last longer than 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Right, but and I may have mentioned this briefly in a previous episode. But so typically, what we do is we keep feeding it, without knowing we're doing it with these negative thoughts. That is like the normal, mental reaction, the typical mental reactions we have. So what is the solution? Well, very, very simple. Stop feeding it. Stop feeding that negative reaction with more of these alarming thoughts. And again, very simple on paper, hard to implement in, the stressful situation itself. And we'll talk about, and will be mainly next week when you talk about things like meditation and so forth, and protocols you can use to kind of deal with that, to train your brain to be more equanimous. But now on the theory part, right? So you must realize that the great majority of your mental suffering is, in a sense, self-inflicted with these negative mental reactions. Yeah. And so the solution is very simple, is stop inflicting that mental pain on you. Yeah. Importantly, that doesn't mean that you stop doing anything, that you don't act. Do anything to the best of your ability to get that flat tire fixed and get to your appointment as quickly as possible. Definitely act in the world, act beneficially in the world for yourself, for others. So equanimity is never about not doing anything and just taking everything lying down. Not at all. It's about acting from a serene state of mind and stopping to punish yourself, with these thoughts that generate these emotions. Yeah. And incidentally, you'll also see that when you go back to a serene state of mind, that, the way you're acting is typically, a better way. So you'll deal with your problems more efficiently.
If I can give a tip here, what we often tend to do, specifically in those situations, is that you think you are the emotion. So as you say, this keeps on happening to me and this is my life. And, that's kind of the amplifier of this feeling, right? That feeds basically the negativity of it all. By just saying I am experiencing this emotion now, which I'm completely entitled to. Anyone would be, would have a 90-second emotional response to the fact that, their tire's flat and they're not going to make it on time. But just by thinking that you are not the emotion, you immediately detach one thing from the other. And that helps greatly. Because you are entitled to have that emotion. I think what you should not say is don't have that emotion, right? Because that emotion is going to hit you. It's going to come to you anyways. But what you should do is say, I am not that emotion. This is something that happens, you laugh at a funny movie. It just happens to you. You think it's funny, even it's an emotion that just happens to you. Allow that emotion to happen. Just say, I am not that emotion, and move on from it, exactly as you say, by acting to get yourself to that meeting then, as fast as possible.
Exactly, Aldo, and that is exactly the key, and it's a key contribution of Buddhism. It's a key element of what today, goes under the name, and this is becoming a broader and broader umbrella of different practices, but of mindfulness and so forth. And so the key there, as you said, is to not identify with these emotions. And identifying with these emotions is what we spontaneously do. It also shows in our language, right? We say, I am mad, I am scared, I am this, that. But in fact, that's a completely wrong way to look at it. Yeah. It is, I feel anger, I feel fear. Yes, all of these things, definitely they happen. They're appearances in consciousness. And if you just let them be, if you accept these emotions, as you also mentioned, they're going to change into something else, and then they're going to be gone before you know it. So,
Yep.
and this is such a key element to not identify with these emotions. And this is what I mean by cultivating this new relation you have to your thoughts and emotions, because it's not only emotions. We also tend to be completely taken over by, the thoughts generated by our brain, and then sometimes these are helpful, good, creative, interesting thoughts, but a lot of times they're not helpful. They're often not even true, and so forth. Think about, people having, very negative thoughts about themselves and so forth. Well, stop being so entranced by, these fleeting products of your brain.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So that's such a key element, right? So this non-identification with it, and as I said, it's one of the key contributions from the Buddhist tradition. It's one of the key elements of mindfulness, and I cannot stress enough how incredibly liberating this can be to develop this new kind of relationship to thoughts and emotions.
I don't know about you, but I am someone who really loves a true crime series. I just can't get enough of them. If I watch them on the streaming platforms, I really cannot stop binging on them. It really is a guilty pleasure. So if you're like me, then you are going to love coldcaseinc.com, which is a platform that offers you unsolved cases of fictional murder mysteries that you can solve. It's a great community of detectives that come together, offering you video and audio evidence, and step by step you can play the game of solving this murder mystery by yourself. We've paired up with the team at coldcaseinc.com, and if you use our code, which is the word MESSY in capital letters, MESSY, then you even get a 15% off your first online membership. So do check out coldcaseinc.com and get crime solving today. We are very happy to be partnering with the Code Zone, which is this amazing platform where people can come together to learn how to code. Creators and future makers, they all come together here, both children as well as adults, to learn how to code and develop things, like for instance their own videos or Minecraft mods. The team at CodeZone believes everyone should be able to learn how to code, young or old, and they've got these amazing subscriptions, very easy and very cheap. You'll learn a lot from them. You could do it live, or you could do it in your own time at your own leisure. We highly recommend it. They are tailored to support individual interests and capabilities, and I'm sure that once you get hooked on the Code Zone, you never want anything more. Check it out, thecodezone.co.uk, or the URL in our show notes.
Otherwise, without this equanimity, you will always be at, the mercy of things happening in your environment. And however lucky you are in life, well, there will be a lot of small and bigger things that do not go your way. And then you will be torturing yourself with negative mental reactions. Well, in fact, what you can do is develop this completely new relationship to these thoughts and emotions, not feeding these negative emotions. Again, going to a serene state of mind, and from that serene state of mind, to the best of your ability, deal with the problem at hand. And you will find yourself much happier and much better at dealing with problems in your life.
Devil's advocate here, and I know this might be taking it too far, and I know, neither of us are medical doctors or psychologists, but what if we encounter trauma? Because trauma it's an overwhelming emotional response. So it basically comes from it has the same origin. Like, it's an emotion, but it's an emotion that you cannot get rid of, right? So trauma is a little bit further than just, being upset that you have a flat tire. It's a lot more than that. And, we, of course, always advise get professional help, most definitely. But in the way you look at it, do you have anything on trauma, anything relevant to say as to where that starts? And am I correct to assume that it knows the same origin, but that it's far more powerful and far more overwhelming?
Yeah, so again, importantly, if you suffer from trauma and so forth, a very good idea to seek professional help. But what will help you, I would say, and this is also what many of these therapies for trauma actually hold, or at least, that's the way they go about it, that is to fully accept and experience the emotions that come up. And this is kind of where our natural reaction stands in the way of the dissolution of any kind of troubles, but also of trauma, right? So we're bracing against the trauma. We do not want to go there. We do not want to experience it. And again, this goes from the very small whatever problems, like I mentioned, the flat tire, but also the major problems in our life that keep reoccurring, that our mind just keeps, hashing up. And then, we experience all of these awful negative emotions again. And so typically, either we try to suppress it, or we try to cope with it by, doing something to distract us. Right, and so that's why people also suffer from addictions and so forth when they're in the grips of trauma. It's just to kind of numb their mind, so to speak, because it creates so much suffering. Right, so instead of pushing it down and just trying to flee from it, which both strategies will not work, will only make it worse in the long term. You should, and I know this is easier said than done, but this goes for all negative emotions that come up. You should allow it to fully come up and fully experience it. But then importantly, and I think we'll talk more about that next week with some of these strategies, importantly, do not go into the stream of your thoughts, right? Because again, that negative emotion is going to produce all kinds of alarming negative thoughts, which only are going to strengthen the emotion, and then you're in that loop again. So what is always the way to go is to accept it, to experience it, to feel it as fully as possible, that negative emotion, but the physical side of it, the physical sensations of it. And this may definitely take some practice, but when you're more practiced at doing so, you may even find that some of these negative feelings and emotions, sensations in your body, when you really give them the proper attention, that there's actually inherently nothing so punishing about them. What you feel is vibrations and heat perhaps, and tension and these kind of things. And so that is what can be so incredibly liberating if you turn our attention back onto itself in a way, and then you turn your attention to what is happening on a physical level in your body. Well, then you stay out of these alarming thoughts, and you allow the emotion to just pass through, and also you develop this new kind of relationship to it, and so the punishing quality quite often is greatly diminished by these practices.
Yeah, I thought I had to ask, but I think what you say makes a lot of sense. Like, the first response of many people is to say, well, I'm not feeling this, I'm moving on, right? I'm moving on from this, or I'm, crying, not accepting the emotions that might come, right? So not giving that a place is actually going to work against you later on, because we hide it, we put it somewhere where it's not supposed to go, and then it comes out in a different way, in a completely illogical way, in completely differently than you thought it would, right? So it always will come back to haunt you if you don't deal with it. It's also something that you often hear, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it keeps on haunting you throughout your life because it keeps on producing these very negative mental reactions. And then so also understand that when you're dealing with, major trauma, that you may not have the possibility right now to fully open up and accept to it. And you also need to accept that, right? You're not ready for it. It's too painful. It's too massive. And so it's something gradual. And again, that's where the enormous importance, of course, of therapy lies in when you're dealing with such a situation. Don't think that, you can do this on your own, that you don't need any help. I think that's also very important to say. But so ultimately, what will deliver you from trauma is never suppressing it, never, coping with it by, medicating yourself and so forth. It will always be, and I think this is clear from lots of the psychological research on it, to completely open up to it, accept it. But again, don't just, keep thinking about it. Accept the emotions that come up, accept the thoughts that come up without, feeding into these emotions and thoughts. Stay out of there, stay mindful, as they say, and this can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah. Beautiful advice. Thank you, Michael. Moving on. The quality of our social connections, but there's one in between there, right, that we haven't discussed yet.
I think maybe we can say something more. I think it's something very interesting. I was kind of hesitating, will I get into there? But since it has such a major liberating potential, I wrote about it in the book, and I would also like to say something about it on this podcast, right?
Sure.
And so it comes from the Buddhist tradition, and so we just talked about, the major importance, and this can make a life-changing impact of, of getting this new perspective. I am not my thoughts, I am not my emotions, I merely observe them. They're fleeting appearances in consciousness, and again, if you let them be, well, within 90 seconds they will gently float out of your consciousness, and it will be replaced by different thoughts, different emotions, and so forth. Right, the Buddhists, they go one way further. They actually see this non-identification in a more radical way, not only in the Buddhist tradition, also in different other traditions, famously in Advaita Vedanta in India, but also in other often called more mystical traditions. Interestingly, what they said about, the brain and the mind actually now is very much validated by science. So that's why we should say something about it. And what they say is that actually the whole feeling of being a self, being an I in control of this whole show called life, is a major illusion. And that this illusion creates a lot of suffering, right? So that's about the illusion of the self. Now, what do they mean by the self being an illusion? Of course, they don't mean that, your body does not exist, that you don't have a brain that produces thoughts and feelings and so forth. So only skeptical philosophers thought about that. And the makers of the movie The Matrix, perhaps. So that's definitely not what they mean. What they mean is that, and this is the intuitive feeling we have, that somewhere in your brain, there's this seat of consciousness, this center of experience from which, you gather all of the information through your senses, and from which you decide to do this, all of your actions, your bodily actions, your speech, and so forth, flows forth. So that's typically what we think. Like when you talk about I, you don't mean your body, because you say, I have a body, right? And so if they cut off your arm, you don't think that part of you is gone, only a part of your body, right? So now you're the same person, but you have, a body with one arm. So what we intuitively mean by I is being this kind of mental entity that runs a show in our head, right? When you ask people to locate that, well, typically that's somewhere behind their eyes. You have the feeling to exist from that space, and you use your senses to get information again, and then you come up with decisions, actions, and so forth, right? So that strong feeling of I. Now, the Buddha and then many others said, well, this is an illusion, and this illusion creates a lot of suffering. And interestingly, science really validates that. So first of all, neurological research shows that the brain is completely decentralized. There's no single place that could, likely be the seat of the soul and so forth. But then other research really shows what actually goes on in your brain and how that illusion is produced. So in the 50s of last century, they did a bunch of very, very interesting experiments. Now, there were people who were suffering from severe cases of epilepsy.
Seizures.
Right? So they had these epileptic attacks, and what these doctors did back in the day is they actually severed the corpus callosum, which is the little bridge between the two hemispheres, because then it would prevent, an epileptic attack from spreading to the whole brain. And at first they thought, interestingly, well, these patients don't really seem to suffer the consequences of this. They seem to function pretty well. But then they said, well, we should at least investigate, because this is a major thing that happened to their brains. And so they came up with a bunch of interesting experiments. So they showed pictures to one eye, the left eye, and this goes then to the right part of the hemisphere, and I may get this backwards, but it doesn't really matter for a story. In the right part of the hemisphere, there's the visual input center, and so the brain saw the information. For instance, it said, get a can of Coke out of the fridge, or something like that. They could see that, or they could see a can of Coke and so forth. And so these people would go up and they would get a can of Coke. But very interestingly, well, their left hemisphere didn't have any access to that information, again, since that bridge between the two hemispheres was severed. And so didn't have access to that information. So they did not know consciously, verbally, that they had seen that information. And then when the experimenter asked them, like, why did you get up? They just made up a story, right? So they just made something up. I was thirsty, and they had absolutely no idea that it was because they got the exact instruction to do so, right? And they showed them pictures of naked people, and they were starting to blush and laugh, and they're like, why are you laughing? And they would instantaneously, without the sliver of a doubt, make up bogus reasons like, because you're looking at me in such a funny way or something like that. And they had no idea they were making stuff up.
Yeah.
Now, very interestingly, that is the way our brain works. Only we can test it in our brains. So what happens is, there's input from the world. The brain has automatic behavior, makes decisions. There's an output, verbal, behaviorally, whatever. It just happens. And then only afterwards do we have the feeling of consciously deciding to go for that decision, right? To have that intention. So there's done different experiments, the so-called Benjamin Libet did those experiments, and incredibly interesting. They asked people to, for instance, press on a left or a right button. And they asked them, well, tell us the moment you decide to do so. So before you press the button, right? So you're there, you're sitting, you have two buttons, and you're like, okay, I'm going to press on the left one. And then you say, now I decided, and then you press, right? Well, the researchers could predict up to 10 seconds before you made a decision. You reported having made a decision on which button you were going to press.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So again, what happens is, you're faced with a situation, the brain already starts the decision and so prepares, the motor centers of your brain to kind of use the left hand and press on the left button or the opposite. And it's only much later, once actually the brain signals, well, this is the decision we're going for. So now you may have, the conscious decision to do so. And so these conscious decisions actually don't really cause the decision. The decision is automatic. And so what words come out of you, what behavior you have, all of that happens automatically. It's the conscious decision to do so is something that is generated in addition to that afterwards. Yeah. And its function, most likely its evolutionary function, is to be able to kind of justify your behaviors, your decisions, and so forth to others. Because together with the conscious decision of doing so, well, your brain also starts producing good reasons why you will do this, why you will have this decision, and so forth, right? So the idea there, or at least, the image of or mental life that emerges from that is that these ideas that there's an I deciding, there's a me at the center of all of this, running this show, is very much an illusion created by the brain. Again, for good evolutionary reasons of justifying our behavior and so forth, and justifying it to others and so forth. And so this idea that the self as a kind of CEO of your brain, right, is an illusion, is seen as a very freeing insight in many traditions. And when you say that to people from a Western culture, well, this typically sounds puzzling. And as well, when I first heard about it as well, it kind of gives a bit of a disconcerting feeling, right? I mean, to have absolutely no control whatsoever. I mean, how can that make you happy, right? And remember your question about control, Aldo, this kind of gets into there. We have the feeling that, no, we need to control more, and control is a good thing. Right, yeah. And so, well, these traditions say quite the opposite. And then actually, now that these kind of insights, and then we'll talk about meditation techniques to foster these insights are being studied, and this is very much at the beginning, so we have to be careful with, big statements here, show that for most people, this actually can be very, very liberating and deliver them from a lot of psychological suffering.
Yeah. What this all makes me think of, Michael, what you're saying is also artificial intelligence, how artificial intelligence works. Because I always thought that I'm so unique and that kind of, my browsing behavior is like I have loads of interests, very, very broad and kind of whatever. And then I see like they can predict already what I'm going to want tomorrow on the basis of previous decisions. So much is being tracked, and that makes you also feel like, okay, how unique am I, right? So it's all kind of defined. There are formats. Your persona is kind of out there. Your online persona is out there. So I know what you're going to want to purchase tomorrow on the basis of what you've purchased yesterday, on the basis of the music you've listened to, on the basis of the conversations you've had, on the basis of the content you've created online, etc., etc., etc. And this is all kind of predictable. This is all kind of, there's a model for you that, that especially now, of course, the online retailers benefit from, but across the board. And I think it makes me feel, in the beginning, I needed to get used to that notion that is like, well, this is how far we go as human beings. Our intelligence can be passed on, kind of our emotions, everything can be captured and understood outside of us. And therefore people can predict as to what we're going to want next. And I thought, it reminds me a lot of that, right? It's kind of, it is now, it cat's out of the bag. It's out there, right? We don't have to ask when that's happening. It's already there.
Definitely,
it reminds me a lot
you're
of
a
that,
bunch of mental patterns kind of repeating themselves, right? But so as we'll see, there's a possibility of having some impact and changing these mental patterns. But so very much so. And I was thinking, first of all, when you mentioned artificial intelligence, that you were making an analogy, which you also could with the way artificial intelligence works, like these large language models like ChatGPT and so forth. What they do is the way they generate text, and so this is one way of having cognitive output, well, is by actually predicting the most likely word to follow the previous word, right? So it's kind of this constant predictions, and this is also to a certain extent the way our brain functions and so forth. But so crucially and importantly, these processes are automatic, and there's no you in there that kind of decides, oh no, let's do this in all of the freedom, and this has major repercussions for debates like free will and so forth. We don't need to get into them, but so the image that is coming forth from neuroscience and cognitive research in general is that we're not, these kind of free entities residing in our brains and running the whole mental show, right? Not at all. And this idea of having a me that takes decisions and so forth is very much illusory. Now, why is this freeing again? I think will be the question that many people will ask at this point. This is, if anything, for most people, disconcerting, right? Well, so the idea here is that most of our mental suffering has to do with this kind of idea and feeling of being a self that is running in the show and that needs to, control things, because otherwise you will be diminished. I mean, this will cause me pain, hurt. I need to avoid this again. I need to get more of this. And so this is the constant kind of tension we're living in. And so freeing yourselves of this illusion of being a self, of being an I that is running the show, actually kind of reduces or gives life back to, the flow of life. So the only things that happen in your experience of life, again, I'm not talking about how the world works and so forth, but so the experience of your life consists of nothing but thoughts, physical sensations, sights, sounds, smells, and tastes. And that's it. There's a constant show of these things. A stream, an endless movie that never ends. And so when you really start understanding this at a deeper level and having a feeling of this, you quickly understand that there's nothing to regret in the past, right? There's only thoughts creeping up like, oh, I wish this wouldn't have happened and so forth. And there's nothing to fear in the future, because however things are going to turn out, all that is going to happen are more, and this is wonderful, more of these thoughts, sensations, sights, sounds, and so forth. It's an endless movie that never stops. And so directly experiencing your life as the unfolding of these experiences that never stops, without, this being this me in the middle that is constantly on the lookout of trouble and so forth, can be incredibly, incredibly freeing. And so that's the idea behind it. And so, again, I said research on this is very, very new. And we'll talk about meditation techniques and so forth in the coming episode. But so techniques to kind of dispel that illusion of the self, to make you see for yourself that there's no self running the show. Well, for most people, but importantly not for all people, but for most people, is considered one of the most liberating things they've learned in their lives, and one of the things that made the most profound impact on their well-being. So it has a major potential. It's also having a more accurate view of what actually goes on of the world, because as I mentioned, science really corroborates this view. But importantly, and that's why I said not for all people, there's also some indication that for some people who have certain kind of mental or psychological vulnerabilities, well, it may be very destabilizing, and therefore you should proceed with caution.
It also sounds something like this can be applied once you are ready, like, on a psychological level, ready to accept certain things. Because I can imagine that, I again identify being a young student. I need to have this sense of self that is in control in order to thrive academically and to give myself perspectives, to give myself these goals. Later on, now, whereas I don't need to get a degree, I need to do the things that I love. I need to kind of do more of that. Like, as you say, this continuous sequence of tastes and sensations and conversations and what have you more, that is kind of a different thing. So it almost sounds like I might have not been ready to accept that at age 19, 20, whereas now at age 44, it opens me up to a lot more consciously.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that last statement. You said you may not have been ready for this before, but I wouldn't say you would need it. And I think this goes to a very important point, and it's good that you bring it up again. That is that if we're going to be, because this is still under the umbrella of equanimity, remember, so if we're going to be completely equanimous, then, well, there's no more motivation, there's nothing we're going to do. That's the end of any kind of ambition and so forth. So, well, we'll radically accept everything that happens. Point, that's it. We can become meditating monks on a mountain top and never leave that mountain top, right? So that's definitely not the case, right? So you can still be very motivated, intrinsically motivated, and we talked about, right, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Let's not repeat that, but you can still be very motivated to do certain things. And if that motivation is even, fed by, altruistic concerns and trying to benefit the world and others, well, this is going to greatly contribute to the feeling of having a meaningful life and having a happy life and so forth. So definitely go for all of that. But just stop punishing yourself needlessly. And this, again, being more equanimous will not only lead to a much freer life, freed from, these endless reverberating sticks in the form of negative emotions and thoughts that or genetic programming unleashes upon us, but also is going to lead to a life in which you will be actually much more efficient to get to your goals, but you will never, and this is so important, never kind of fool yourself that you can only be happy if these goals actually are met, because that does not only depend on you. All you can do is, in a way, your best, as it often said, and then the world will do what it does, and the chips will fall where they may. And stop thinking like, I need the world to actually be completely in this state, then, only then can I be happy, because this is keeping you miserable, and it's just not true.
There is no point in denying it. I am in love. And you might have already known it, that I was in love with podcasting and interviewing people all over the world. Well, I'm also in love now with a recording tool for our podcast episodes, which is called Riverside.fm. I've kissed many frogs when it came to recording episodes, but this one is really the one with the most amazing studio features. Riverside really offers you everything you need in creating the perfect episode, whether these are short or long, whether these are multiple people you're talking to or just you, or whether this is about your show notes or the video recording or even creating easy snippets that you can use on social media. Riverside truly has it all. If you go to our show notes, you will find a link to Riverside, and if you use that link, you'll even get a 20% discount. Yes, you heard that correctly, a 20% discount in getting started with this incredible podcast recording tool. Look no more, Riverside.fm is here.
Research shows this. These external events have less impact on our happiness.
But let me rephrase then. I think equanimity, the inside of equanimity, there's a different fit depending on your age. Because equanimity for me at age 40 means something completely different than it means at age 20. So you kind of need to make sure it translates well, because otherwise you could end up in the needless suffering section again, Yeah.
I do think, the key element there, and we've talked about a lot, but let's go back to the core here. What we want to do is not feeding negative emotions and accepting what we cannot change, right? And I think everybody will understand the wisdom of that. Right? There's no need to torture yourself. There is perhaps a very great need to do things in the world and make the things better. Again, please do that. It's not about this. Right, but stop punishing yourself psychologically. And when things are such that you cannot change them, well, accept them. That is the only way to move on. And I think this kind of leads nicely up to the next element, and that is contentment, right? And so we've talked about accepting what we cannot change. There's this very well-known serenity prayer in the Christian tradition, right? It goes something like, God, give me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, give me the courage to change what I can change, and give me the wisdom to tell the difference between the two. Right? So this is, in the Christian tradition, but actually that idea very much originated with the Stoics. Word Christian obviously started in ancient Greece, then in ancient Greece, and then the Romans developed it. And so the Stoic philosophy was also all about cultivating that equanimity and that kind of contentment. So as I said, these very different traditions, East and West, they zoned in on exactly the same recipe for happiness. And now science shows the great potential of these things and the great importance of these elements. And in a way you could say, well, Stoic philosophy, you can actually summarize their view in one sentence, right? Make the difference between what you cannot and what you can control, and only accord importance to the latter. So only importance to what you can control. What can you not control according to the Stoics? Your reputation, your wealth, things going well in the world, things not going well, all of these things. What can you control? Very simply, your attitude, your reactions, what you say, what you do. Right, so that's a Stoic view. Now, the Buddhists would have a problem with this view of a self and so forth. Let's not get back into that. But so what the Stoics say is like, look, we're constantly, racking our brain and thinking about possible scenarios in the future and so forth. So we're constantly obsessing about what we cannot control. Right? I hope this doesn't happen. Oh, this should happen. Oh, I hope this will be the case, and so forth. And there's only almost no attention going to what we actually can control. Like, if this bad thing would happen, like, how would I react? So the Stoics are all about, cultivating the latter and, reacting with equanimity, with wisdom, with courage, and so forth.
I'm quickly going back, because I want to interrupt here, because I do think, and here's where we have a collective responsibility to also recognize the tools that we use. And again, I'm specifically referring to social media, and I know we've elaborately analyzed that, but that specific bit confuses us in what we can control and what we cannot control. And I think it's done intentionally, specifically with this news cycle, right? There's this famous sketch, Amy Schumer, American comedy artist. She, it was once, and I thought it was so funny, that she said something around Trump and Trump being sued or not, and one of the, at the time when he was president, one of his ministers who resigned or didn't resign. And it says like, people just, they come out screaming on the streets like, oh, this guy resigned. And she goes like, she gives us feedback like, dude, you work at Petco. And Petco is like an animal food store, right? So just to put it in perspective, it's like this guy is all kind of warmed up over the fact that, this minister resigned. But then, put it in perspective, you work at Petco. So what can you possibly do to the fact that this minister is going to resign, yes or not, right? But the way it is passed on to this guy, right, and then specifically referring to social media and the news cycle and whatever we see, the TVs that are on, makes us think that we can control it in some shape or form because it's continuously in our face. And you can say, well, turn off the TV or don't look at your phone, but that's easier said than done, right? So this control element, I think because we're continuously looking at it, at a certain point we start thinking, yes, I can control this. We're exposed to it 24/7. So at some point we make the click in our heads, like there might be something that I can do to control this.
Yeah, that's the irony of it. I mean,
Yeah.
we obsess so much about so many things, and we create so much suffering over these things, but we don't do a single thing in the world to actually solve that problem. Sometimes it's impossible for us to do anything about it, but even think about all of these problems and how long, the many hours you've been obsessing about them, and have they yielded so many great solutions that then protected you against these problems? Well, definitely not to the same extent that they cause you pain, right? So again, it's not about not doing anything in the world. I think from a serene state of mind, you think much more clearly and you come up with better solutions, right?
Yeah.
So if you would more focus on making the world a better place and less about obsessing psychologically how bad a place it is for our own lives in general and so forth, well, we would do a great thing for the world and for ourselves. Right, and so this is very much what the Stoics would say, because the Stoics were all about equanimity, but they were definitely not all about not interacting in the world. One of the most famous Stoics was Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor of Rome, so to say. I mean, that's a person who had a major impact on the world in his day and age. Another one was Seneca. I mean, and he was he was in politics and so forth, in the Senate, and so these were people incredibly idealistic and highly involved with improving the world, but all of this from a very equanimous state of mind. And I think we can take an example there. It will improve our lives, it will improve the world.
We can most definitely. And I think we also need to look at, we live in a day and age of an attention economy, right? There are loads of things being thrown at us. People are continuously begging for our attention because our attention is money, right? And I think when Seneca was around, or Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't as such. And I think it's good, right? It's good to read up on what they said, but also translate that to the attention challenges that we have these days, to make sure that we make a clear distinction between what we can and cannot control. Because I 100% agree, it only makes sense to go after that what we can control. But I do think we live in an era whereby people want our attention continuously, that they provide us with things that have the appearance that we can control the narrative of that as well, whereas we should realize that we cannot, right? And that is a difficult distinction to make sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just creating the habit of asking yourselves, like, can I do something about it?
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Asking the proactive
no
question.
need to torture myself.
Yeah.
Just time for action.
Yeah.
Can I do something about it? No. All right. No need to torture myself about it. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only thing. And if we would ask ourselves that every time, well, we'd be much better off. And again, probably the world would be better off, because many times we can actually do something in some way about it. Let's do it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Make the world a better place. Definitely.
Do you do it, Michael? Are you a Stoic? Yeah.
I try to, but I'm also a work in progress very much, Aldo. So I try to more and more every day.
Yeah. It is challenging though, no?
It is, yeah. And as I said, our nature is to start obsessing about these things. Remember our hyperactive threat detection, the negativity bias, and our mind just keeps on, generating all of these negative feelings, these negative thoughts. And it even often becomes very counterproductive, right? And I see this with climate change as well in certain students, and they're very idealistic and it's beautiful and they think it's such an important problem, and they're 100% right. But sometimes they have this, incredible pessimism about the state of the world, and then they have a feeling that it's all gone to shreds, and we're never gonna get there. And so this idea actually makes you more, and research shows this, makes you more passive, makes you do less things for the environment, because you have a feeling, it's not gonna matter anyway.
Yeah. But I think, again, and we did a previous interview on this, so no need to dive into detail about that. But that what you say, like, the doom and gloom sells better than, the good news, right? So
Exactly.
if you
And that has
write
everything
about,
to do with our
yeah,
mind. Our
yeah,
mind is on the lookout for doom and gloom, not
yeah,
for good news.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
it's a problem, but we can rewire our mind. And this is that second important element in contentment. So, what
yeah,
you need to do, we've covered equanimity. Now we're with contentment, right? First of all, know that many of these carrots, which I call fake carrots, um, are not going to make you lastingly happy. That
yeah,
promotion on your job, the new house, this and that, and so forth. So we constantly think, well, I'm only going to be happy if I get this.
yeah,
No, this is an illusion. And knowing that is an illusion actually kind of frees you from the craving and so
yeah.
enhances your happiness, right? Again, doesn't mean don't have any ambition. Go for all of these things, but stop fooling yourself that you'll only be happy when you reach it. Right, so that's a very important first one. A second one is, and we'll get to this in more detail next episode when we talk about how to implement all of this, is to kind of rewire and train your brain to have more attention for positive things.
Yeah.
Right, so there's a lot of research that shows that having these kind of gratitude practices, which have been around in many traditions, including Western traditions, are actually can have a very positive impact. So focus on the good things. And therefore it creates this kind of balance in which you kind of train your brain not only to see all of the doom and gloom, but train your brain to become more in equilibrium and actually see all of the nice things in life, and therefore improve the quality of your life. So that's so incredibly important, and it really can transform the experience of your life.
Wonderful. And then you said something about social connections.
Exactly. That is our last element that has a profound impact on our well-being. So I've mentioned, I think, the study done at Harvard, the longest study on happiness. They followed people throughout their whole lives, and the biggest conclusion of how happy their lives were, but also how long and healthy these lives were, was the quality of their social connections. You don't need a lot of friends, only, a very few, but very good friends are key for happiness. Right. Yeah. There's also an interesting book written by an Australian nurse, and she was working with people who were dying. So at the end of their lives, and she got into the habit of asking them what they regretted the most in their lives. And she wrote a book about it, Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. And 3 of those 5 regrets are about, not giving enough importance to these social relationships. One is, I wish I didn't work that hard and I spent more time with family and friends. Second one is, I wish I showed my emotions more and therefore created closer connections with other people and got more support from my close people. And then the final thing is, I wish I would have cherished my friends anymore. I wouldn't have lost contact with these very good friends and so forth. So we all kind of know this, but this is our true ticket to happiness. It's the social relationships. And we've talked about, remember, dopamine in one of the previous episodes. We've talked about dopamine and addiction, also dopamine and hedonic adaptation, right? So when you get that new sports car, you get a little peak of happiness, fueled by dopamine, and it just reabsorbs so quickly, and so you get used to it in incredibly short time. That doesn't happen for the oxytocin, which is our, you could call it our cuddle hormone, right?
Yeah.
The hormone we make when we have close interactions, loving interactions with other people. That doesn't happen. Having a loving interaction with a good friend is as good at age 50 as it was at age 20, right? So that's the one carrot that is not fake. Right, so this carrot will keep on nourishing your long-term happiness, and knowing that that is where your best ticket to long-term happiness resides, well, is, I think, very important. And we kind of all do, but quite often, as is evident from the top 5 regret of the dying, we don't live by that truth or by that insight, right? And we don't give it the priority it actually deserves.
What do the Stoics say about that?
Well, the Stoics were all about, altruism, and we'll show altruism as well, and living for other people, the Buddhists even more, and so forth. They write quite a bit of about friendship, but actually the ancient philosophers that were most concerned with friendship were the Epicureans, and they lived in communities of friends, and then they were all about nurturing this. So this maybe has gotten a little bit less attention in the Stoic philosophy, but in other Western and Eastern philosophies, it got a lot of attention, right? And so now it's clear from research how incredibly important this part is in the puzzle.
And so looking at Eastern philosophy, so we might have discussed that in a previous interview, but family life was very different, and maybe to this day is still different, for instance, in Southeast Asia as it is here, whereby the family still stays together, right? So the grandparents move in with the children at some age and help out, and, people stay together. Is that also an example of social connections? Because we tend to individualize and kind of, go our own way, move away from our parents, speak of what we don't, we love them, but we don't want to have them around too much, or, or kind of, because everyone has their lives and stuff like that. So something in our society is not 100% catered to harnessing or nurturing social connections, specifically maybe on a family level. But have you found anything on that and anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think, and we kind of mentioned this in last episode on loneliness. Remember, 1 in 3 adults suffers from loneliness, and it has a lot of, has everything to do with our modern environment. This wouldn't have happened in ancestral times. We lived in close-knitted tribes and so forth. You would never become isolated, even not at a later age and so forth. And so this is a major problem of our world, and it's especially a problem in our more individualistic societies. So in many Western societies, indeed, I think, on a social level as well, there's a lot of work to be done there, and a kind of recalibrating of what kind of society we want to create and what kind of society delivers the greatest well-being to the people. And we're not getting it right in certain respects. And this definitely is one aspect in which we provide roadblocks for a happy life, a happy community.
Yeah. It's funny how happiness should be an essential building block of our society, right? And how sometimes that's completely off. That we use these hedonic adaptation things, these very fickle, quickly disappearing elements, and confuse that for happiness. But also that certain things that, and again I come back to this, we know better, but still we don't always act on it, right? It'll do you well to call that good friend of yours. Still you don't, because there are 27 other things on your to-do list, or, so you keep telling yourself. So, so there are so many of those things that are contradictory to one another, whereas if we know that it actually is going to help us and is going to also make us thrive eventually economically if we're happier, then why don't we? What went wrong?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's again the irony of it all. Like everything we do, in some sense, is connected to our happiness or that of others. That's the ultimate goal, and so it's what is behind every action, every decision, and so forth. But so many of these actions, decisions of what we do, actually do not contribute to our happiness. Even worse, they kind of contribute quite sometimes to our misery. And so, being more informed about that and making it explicit in your mind, no, this is actually what will lead to happiness in the long run, is so incredibly important. And so this is very much what I hope to contribute with our conversation here and with my book, obviously, because it is not complicated. And that's the beauty of it. It's pretty simple, right? So we discuss these 3 very important pillars. Stop feeding the negative emotions, cultivate more contentment, and then, cherish these close connections, and then perhaps live altruistically, because also and we'll get into that in the next episode, research shows how incredibly important that is. It gets us out of our ruminating mind, and it gives us a purpose and so forth. So if we start living along these lines, well, happiness will surely follow, and a deep kind of happiness that is not at the mercy of the whims of things going well or not well in the external world, which we'll never have a grip on.
Yeah. I'm just going back to the social connections bit, because I do think it's important that social connections, that's continuous, right? It's not that, some people might not have been in a situation whereby they have this entire list of friends from the early days, but there are other ways to start social connections, right? It's the acknowledgement that we are a social being and start looking to make those connections that you refer to as well, right? I want to make sure everyone, it's good for you to get out, right? And to find to find circles whereby people do social stuff and make sure you talk to people and see what binds you, see what you have in common. It's healthy.
Definitely, and we all know like having good friends is important and is nurturing and so forth. So we all know this, but we could give it more priority. But what we often tend to, and I'm the same there, what we often do not see is that even these kind of superficial social interactions we have throughout the day. You know, you go to the supermarket, you see a cashier and so forth. You have a little talk. How are you? Great, thanks. That does a lot for your happiness throughout the day, right? So, and we're creating a world in which more and more things are automatized. So you don't need to actually interact with people. Maybe you have a self-checkout and so forth, and so you don't need to talk to people and you get your groceries. Well, they've seen that actually that does not contribute to happiness. So if you have a choice, go to the cashier, have the little talk, and interact with many people. And that's also what they found, in COVID days, and in which, that social distance was actually preventing everyone from having these daily little interactions. I mean, and then the great toll it took, right? So this is so incredibly important. We're wired as social beings. And so to be happy, we should live socially. And that will be different for different kinds of people. You have introverts, you have extroverted people. So extroverted people will need more of these interactions, more friends and so forth, but everybody will need at least, this core of very nurturing social interactions. And how that will be, again, is different for everybody, but what is the same for everybody is the need for this. And
most
do not
definitely
underestimate it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Vlerick. And a reading tip here, The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying by that Australian nurse. So we're going to include it in our show notes because I do think that's a beautiful thing to look at, as well as the literature of the Stoics, because I know they've done some writing, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, if it's digestible or if there's maybe a translation or, that people can get into. Any more reading you would recommend?
Well, a lot of reading, and it's hard to give the titles there, but indeed, on the Stoics, maybe you can even start with just a book written about the Stoic philosophy, and I think that can be incredibly illuminating. But otherwise, there's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius is a famous classic, and it shows how similar their problems were to ours, and the kind of things that stood in the way of the happiness and the approaches and so forth. So there's a lot that you can read up on, definitely.
Loads there. Yeah, well, so this was again a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Michael, for taking us through the simple recipe for happiness, the 3 things that we kind of need to accept to become happy based on loads of philosophy, religion from all parts of the world. I think it is and remains a fascinating journey on the road to happiness. Our next interview, what is that going to be about, Michael?
Well, our next interview is about implementing all of this, because now we have the theory, right? So work on equanimity, contentment, and these loving interactions. But it's not just going to happen by consciously deciding, I'm going to be more equanimous, I'm going to be more content. We have these mental patterns. So how can you reprogram your brain to be less, in the grips of negative emotions? How can you reprogram your brain to have more attention for the good things and to be more content, to be less craving, which stands in the way of your happiness, and so forth. So we're going to talk about all of these practices that we can actually do that will make a massive difference, right? So now we have, the recipe in place. Now it's time to start cooking and make that beautiful, beautiful pie that is going to be your happiness.
Wow, that's a beautiful finale. Thank you so much, Michael, for taking us through all of this. Thank you so much, dear listener, for staying with us and listening in to Michael. I hope you found this as fascinating as I did. A very big, warm thank you to you, Michael, Dr. Michael Vlerick.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the next episode.
If you liked this episode, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Philip Anderson for our beautiful theme music. This episode was edited by Natalie Piles with production assistance from Genta Metalia.